Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. It's NQA webinar, ISO 50001 Transition Essentials, 1 year to go. Always like to say that right at the start, make sure that you're in the right place and you're getting what you're expecting. So my name's Richard Walsh. Just looking quickly down the attendance list, there's a number of names of people that I recognise and a number of clients that I've currently working with. So welcome to you, and also welcome to those people who may not have joined us before. So as I sort of semi-joke, we've a couple of slides at the beginning that I tend to say it's a word from our sponsors, a bit like the adverts, so I'm contractually obliged to go through these. So just a couple of slides as I'm talking, just to tell you a little bit about NQA if you've not come across us before, but I suspect most of you have. So there's a little bit about who we are and where we are and the type of things that we work in, and sort of the courses that we deliver and how and where we deliver them, and a little bit about the feedback that we get. We're very proud of the positive feedback we get from our clients, both in terms of the training we offer, the webinars we deliver, but most importantly, our certification processes. That's me. Don't like looking at myself, so I might get rid of that slide pretty quickly. But that's just a little bit about who I am and a little bit about my background. I've been at NQA since 2007. I previously spent about 11 years working for a large environmental charity. I see one of my colleagues from there is, in fact, my previous boss is on here, I think. Good afternoon, Stephen. And I worked at Groundwork in the bit that's known as Environmental Business Services, working in consultancy and offering training and advice to businesses on environmental matters. Right, that's all the housekeeping and stuff sorted out as to who we are and who I am. Couple of things just about the somebody's already lost communication. He's done well to tell me he's lost communication. Can somebody just let me know? I assume you can all hear me okay. I don't want everybody, this is going to be dangerous now. Can a couple of people just let me know that you can still hear me loud and clear? And I need to just check whether it's, I think there's a few people putting their hands up. Yeah, thank you, that's fine. I've got a couple now, so if you're in the middle of typing, don't, otherwise the inbox is going to be full. So I think, I don't know whether Dave, or was it the task? Dave Smith, I think it was. It may be at your end if you can hear me, but other people have said they can hear me fine, so we'll push on. A couple of things. You don't need to frantically scribble down everything I'm saying. That's a start, because all of our webinars, if you didn't know, are recorded. They all appear on our YouTube channel. So if you go onto YouTube and look for channels, and then search for NQA, you'll find recordings of this and all the other webinars that I and other colleagues have done on a wide range of topics, all mostly related to management system standards. That's the first thing. Anybody who's registered for this, so not just the people who attend, but the 150 odd people who registered, will also get an email with a copy of the slides, PDF copy of the slides, and also a link to that recording, to that YouTube recording. So you can get all that. So there's no need to start writing everything down. And as people have quite also realised, if you have any questions that you want to ask as we're going through, then type them into the question box. I can see those appear. The rest of you can't. But I can see those appear. Dave Smith left us now by the look, so it may be that his communications at his end, not at ours. So yeah, if you type a question in there, as we've had a couple of comments in there already, we'll get round to answering them. There is a section at the end on questions and answers, but if I feel it's appropriate to answer a question as we're going along, then I will do that. So I always say I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of questions at the end. But I usually end up talking for about an hour, and then we go over. That's fine. If you want to leave at any time, feel free. I won't take it personally, and but we'll try and get some questions in at the end if need be. Right. So these are the sorts of things we're going to be looking at on this webinar. Obviously, the new 50,001 standard, the 2018 version of the standard, it's not that new now. It's 2.5 years old. They're not really new concepts anymore, but a reminder of what they are. The main element of this presentation is to look at the clauses, look at what the clauses mean, look at if there's any differences to the clauses, and also maybe touch on some of the things that we as a certification body would need to see. We're going to have a chat about the transition process, and then some bits towards the end on tips, and obviously, as I said, a question and answer session right at the very end. So hopefully, by the end of today, I'd like to think that you have a better understanding of 50,001 itself, that we've got to grips with the new terminology and the wording and the things that are in the standard, and some important definitions that have been introduced in the standard. We're obviously going to look at the specific new clauses and, as I said, the requirements and evidence that we'd want to see. Look at the transition timelines, because we're still going, and as the title of this webinar suggests, a year to go. And some little bit at the end, some thoughts from me on maybe how to make a success of the transition process, and making sure that you get through that successfully and maintain certification, because that's at the end of the day what we all want. So why did the standard actually change? First of all, that's one of the things that we need to think about. But also to look at really what the standards are all about. All of these newish standards, so I'm including within that 14,001, 9,001, which of course are now 5.5 years old, the 2015 versions. All of these new standards in this, what they call the Annex SL format, all of these standards have an intended outcome. And this standard 50,001 is no different. The intended outcome is continual improvement in energy performance, and that's a key intended outcome, but the fulfillment of compliance obligations and the achievement of your set energy objectives. So those are the intended outcomes. The other overarching concept with all of these new standards is being a little bit more thoughtful as to how we manage change. I tend to say that all of the Annex SL standards are now more proactive rather than reactive, and there's a greater emphasis within the standards on the planning process. So planning to do something and then actually going and doing it rather than necessarily just doing it. Now obviously they all still follow the old Deming cycle, plan, do, check, act, but I think that they've sort of ramped up the planning section. But they also cover the management of risk, and because they're all being set out in this new format, they are all designed to integrate with the other standards. So I have a number of clients that have got 9 and 14, have people with 9, 14 and 45, health and safety. I have a number of clients with just 14 and 50. So there's quite a wide range of sort of different integrations that we see as we go through. A little bit of history about where the standards have come from. So sort of at the turn of this last millennium, turn of the century, around sort of 2000-ish, there was a sort of first foray into sort of energy management standards. But the real launch, if you like, was back in 2009. And this standard, I have to say, has followed all the other standards really that start out with the British standard. It's one area that we seem to lead the way. And just in the same way that, 9,001 came from BS 5750, 14,001 came from BS 7750, and this standard 50,001 grew out of a British standard although it's down there as a European standard, which it developed into, but it was BS 16001, which came out in 2009, and it was pretty quickly taken over and published in 2011 as ISO 50001, the standard that we know now. And of course, that was changed, and that had its republication in the updated Annex SL version in 2018. So just to look at that on a slightly different graphic, so we can see there that the original standard was issued in 2011. In 2017, there was a draft version, and the final version was issued in 2018 on the 21st of August. Now, a fairly important point here is that running a webinar like this was originally planned for last August, because that was its 3-year transition period. However, because of the situation we find ourselves in with COVID-19, this and ISO 45001 on health and safety have had their transition periods extended. And for this standard, the transition period now ends on the 31st of January 2022. So technically, the 1-year webinar should have been run on Sunday, but we didn't want to get you all out on a Sunday afternoon. So we're running this on not quite the closest day, because we could have done it on Monday, but we're running this webinar now as 12 months to go. So it's a bit of a nudge that if you haven't thought about transitioning, you need to. And certainly, whether you're an NQA client or not, your certification body should be certainly chasing you up now, wanting to know what your transition plans are. Obviously, any new certifications we take on board now have to be to the new standard. We're not doing any certification now to the old 2011 standard. There might be a couple of surveillance visits that are still outstanding, but generally everything we're doing now is to the new 2018 standard. So why do we need to change? We were quite happy with the old standard. It was working well. Do we need to start changing things? Well, obviously all standards change, mainly to try and maintain the relevance to industry and other organisations. This standard is anticipated to be in place for probably 8 to 10 years. 14,001 as yet, I don't think we've started work formally on the next version of 14,001. Obviously, that's 5 years old now. My director as now sits on TC 207, which is a technical committee for 14,001. And as far as I'm aware, there's no formal process started yet to there's obviously some discussions, but there's no formal process started yet in terms of updating that standard. So this standard's a long way behind. I fully anticipate this standard being in place for the next 10 years. We try and make sure that the standards reflect the increasingly complex environments in which organisations operate. And if you think about particularly energy management, you know, the first energy standard, as we saw from that slide, came around 20 years ago. I think we have a totally different view on energy and energy management now than what we had 20 years ago. And I think even in the last 10 years, you know, since I started at NQA in 2007, our understanding of energy management has changed. The technology behind energy management has changed. You know, LEDs in 2007 were a novelty really in terms of large-scale lighting. Now it's sort of the norm. So there's a lot of things that change, and the standards needs to reflect that. These standards try also to reflect the fact that they could be used by any organisation. There's always been a little bit of a, particularly on quality, I think, but there's always been a bit of a, what's the word? Complaint, if you like, or comments that these standards read fine if you're a manufacturing organisation, but if we're a service industry, they don't appear quite as relevant. Well, they've tried to make sure that the standards reflect all potential users, not just manufacturing. As I've said earlier, there's a greater focus on on planning, but also on corporate governance. So what used to be senior management commitment is now leadership. And ultimately, there was this push from easier integration. So to try and get standards that would all fit together, because obviously, if you look at 14,001 and you looked at 9,001 and you looked at 50,001, the old versions, even the clause numbers didn't align. All the clause numbers align now. This standard has followed Annex SL almost, and we'll look at what I mean by almost in a short while. Sadly, they've chosen to drift away from the Annex SL format a little bit. That is the Annex SL format. I'm sure you've seen it before. Clauses 1 to 10. The clauses we're interested in are clauses 4 to 10. Clauses 1, 2, and 3 sort of set the scene. Clause 1 scope, let's clear that up now, is not your scope. Clause 1 in any of the standards is the scope of the standard itself. So in other words, what is the standard all about? What's the standard trying to achieve? Your scope as an organisation comes later in the auditable clauses. So when we audit, we're only looking at those 7 clauses, clauses 4 to 10. Skip through that. That's technical. That's a direct copy from the standard. That's the standard put into the Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA, Deming cycle, call it what you will. And those are the clauses of this standard set against the Plan, Do, Check, Act. I tend to prefer this slide. It's quite interesting. I produced this some time ago. I've seen this copied all over the place. I've seen lots and lots of people use this in their presentations. I can claim that it's mine, but I'm happy for anybody to use it, to be honest. Imitation's the best form of flattery. So feel free to use any of this sort of stuff, really. I don't mind. Okay, so that's it set out again, Plan, Do, Check, Act, but also now shows the clauses and all of the sub clauses beneath that. And again, obviously, easy integration. Sorry, I've just clicked twice. Easy integration, that's the whole idea, that the standards will all fit together into a fully integrated system. One of the questions I sometimes get asked is, do we really need 50,001 if we've got 14? Can we not manage our energy just using 14,001? And the answer is yes, you can. However, it fits in that 14,001 addresses all significant environmental impacts of an organisation, including energy. But 50,001, if you like, takes that energy management to a higher level. It focuses purely on energy performance improvement. And both standards can be implemented individually, or they can be integrated with each other, as you can with any other ISO standard. But what we tend to advise is if energy is your most significant environmental impact, then using 50,001 alongside 14 might give you that little bit of added impetus. It does take energy management to a higher level, and for a lot of people, the driver for 50,001 is it ticks the box for your ESOS compliance. ESOS being the Energy Saving Opportunities Scheme, which is a 4-yearly scheme requiring large businesses to report on their energy usage. And having 50,001 saves you having to do an awful lot of reporting. You could just fire off your, in our case, NQA certificate and say, there you go, we've complied with that piece of legislation. So a lot of people use it as a way of complying with the ESOS regulations. A couple of terms and definitions that I just want to pick up on. These are more, apart from the bottom one, these are more related to the whole Annex SL stream of standards. So it talks about correction and corrective action. So correction is action to eliminate a detected non-conformity. Corrective action, action to eliminate the cause of a detected non-conformity. And in red, as you'll see, the term preventive action has been dropped from all of these standards as a specific clause. We still talk about preventive action. I still talk about it. I still see clients that use the term, and my view is you can call it what on earth you like. It doesn't matter. But really what the standard is saying is the concept of preventive action is now within sort of the planning clause, really. So clause 6, where we're planning what we're going to do, that is where the preventive action comes in, because arguably, if something's happened, you can stop it happening again, but you're not really preventing it. It's sort of it's still corrective action if you are trying to stop something happening a second or third time. So the whole concept of preventive action is wrapped up now in the planning phase. Right, nobody's asked any questions at the moment. That's fine. I've either bored you to death or I've told you everything you need to know at the moment. So I'm hoping that I've not bored you to death. What we're now going to do is the main part of it, probably the next sort of 25 minutes or so, if not a bit longer, is going to take us through all of the clauses of the standards. If you think of that linear chart that I showed, we're going to go through every one of those boxes now and look at what we mean. Thank you. Thank you. Good. We're doing all right. Some positive comments. Thank you. You're all still awake. I know it's Friday afternoon and you've just had your lunch, but we'll keep going. Right. Okay. So start at the beginning. As my headmaster used to say, begin at the beginning, go on to the end, and then stop. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to take each clause one at a time. So context of the organization. Now, if you've got a client that's already got 14,001, has got 9,001, this clause context should be second nature to them. And I would argue if you've got 14,001, then you're probably already in place with what you need, because obviously, as I said earlier, 14,001 does include energy. So anything that's in the 14,001 context is probably going to cover, in most cases, what you need for energy management. It's whether you need to maybe draw out or maybe concentrate a little bit more on some of the particular energy areas within context. But it's all about determining the external and internal issues that are relevant to what you do as an organization and that affect your ability to achieve the intended outcome of the energy management system. And that's what an ENMS is, energy management system, to define it from an EMS, which is environmental. Now, one of the things I like to try and do is to avoid using standard speak and to put things into I was going to say broad Yorkshire, but put things into something that's easily understandable. And the way I try and define context is, if you think back to the intended outcomes, the intended outcome was to continually improve your energy performance. There are things that are going to help you do that, and there are things that are going to get in the way. The things that are going to help you become the opportunities, and we need to maximize on those opportunities. The things that are going to get in the way are the risks, and we need to look at a way of mitigating or removing those risks if we can. So this particular clause, clause 4.1, flows onwards into clause 6.1, which is a section on risks and opportunities, and that's the way we look at how those two clauses link up. So the things that you identify that are going to get in the way become the risks, the things that are going to help you become the opportunities. And it's as simple as that. So that's where we're going on that. Now, obviously, within this particular clause, and we'll come on to interested parties shortly, but legislation has been tucked away in clause 4, and we'll look at that in a minute. But this is all about making sure that from an energy perspective, that your energy management system is focusing on the issues that present the greatest risk, positive or negative. I know the standard uses the term opportunities, but actually it talks about positive and negative risks, and a positive risk is an opportunity. So it's about making sure that the system is there to help you. Now, this is just a starter. For 10, there's no particular, it's not a sort of a complete list at all, and it's up to you how you do this. This is just one way that I've put it together. Energy related issues, external issues and internal issues, and you can all see what's on there. You can see what they are all about. That's just to give you some ideas of the sorts of things you might want to think about. But ultimately, the intention of this clause is to provide a high-level understanding of the important issues that can positively or negatively affect the way in which energy responsibilities are managed. That's what we're trying to draw out at this point. Now, again, a clause that's already in the other standards, and again, this is likely to be in place if you've, unless you've purely just got a standalone 50,001 system, is the interested parties. So in other words, this is who has a legitimate interest in what we're doing from an energy perspective. And we need to think about, of all of those people that have a legitimate interest, which ones we're going to sort of engage with, work with, or even comply with. Now, as an absolute minimum, all relevant legal requirements must be included and reviewed at defined intervals. Now, rather interesting, as I say, this is the bit that's gone away from, or one of the bits that's gone away from the Annex SL format. In 14,001, clause 6.1.3 is the clause on compliance obligations. This standard doesn't use the term compliance obligations. This standard has chosen, rather bizarrely, to still retain the term legal and other requirements, first of all. However, what they haven't done is have a separate clause. They could have quite easily just lifted the 14,001 clause and copied it across with no work. They could have just copied and pasted it, and there you go. We know it works. We'll just use that. No, they've decided to stick it away in interested parties. Now, if you've already got a system that's say 14,001 applicable, certified, and you are working with your legal register in the way that 14,001 applies, you don't have to do it again under interested parties. What we as a certification body are more interested in is that you are doing something, not where it's necessarily pigeonholed. So if you want to do things in the 14,001 way, if you want to call them compliance obligations, then fine, it's not a problem at all. And already your 14,001 legal register, compliance obligation register, call it what you will, should have all of the necessary energy obligations in there anyway. Now, again, the standard says that you can choose which of these needs of interested parties that you must meet, with, of course, the exception of legislative requirements. I'm not going to spend any time on that slide. I think we've seen that many, many times. We all know who these interested parties may or may be. That's a fairly standard list. But from the regulatory side, obviously, it's the next to the bottom bullet point that's the important one, the regulators. Scope of the ENMS, that is another area that has changed slightly. And it's an area that has caused a little bit of questioning. And it's slightly different to how the scope is set out in 14,001, 9,001, etc. Obviously, you can certify the whole or the part of an organisation. That's not a problem. You can decide what boundaries you're going to set. However, you cannot use the scope to exclude a particular energy type. So, for instance, if you are, say, a manufacturing organisation, as I work with a couple who import steam to use in a manufacturing process, you can't decide, well, actually, we'll exclude that particular part of our organisation from the scope. So the scope that is chosen has to include all of the energy types used by the business. Now, when we mean energy types, we're talking gas, electricity, steam, oil, diesel. Those are the main energy types that we're talking about. Renewable is still electricity at the end of the day. So those are the main sort of 4 or 5 energy types that we talk about. And the scope has to include those. The next bit that prompted a lot of questions to us, particularly, was you must have authority to control energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption within the scope. So I had a couple of people in the very first instance when we started doing certifications to this new standard saying, one of our sites within scope is in a fully managed office block. So they've got a floor of an office block. There's no sub-metering. They don't know how much energy they're using. They're not billed separately for energy. Energy usage is within the rent. is that allowable under that particular bullet point? And my answer was yes. Yes, it's a bit of a difficulty if you can't exactly get the energy figures. We can talk about that later if need be. But actually, my question back to them is, can you alter the temperature? Can you turn the lights on and off? Can you decide whether you switch a computer on or off or leave the screen going overnight? Yes, you can. So even if you're in a fully managed set of premises, you still have the authority to control your own energy efficiency. Yes, you might not be able to rip the lights out and put some new LED lights in. You might not be able to change the heating system, but usually you do have a limited amount of control over how energy is being used. So I've yet to come across anybody that we can't tick that box. So don't worry if you read that particular clause and think, hell, what we're going to do. I don't have an issue with it, and none of our assessors have an issue. However, again, as with 14,001, the scope and the boundaries of the system must be made available as documented information. Just one other little rider. If you're going to use this standard for ESOS compliance, then the scope that you choose must account for 90% of your organization's total energy usage. That's a requirement under ESOS. It's not within the standard, but that's an ESOS requirement if you're going to use this standard as complying with ESOS. Obviously, the standard has a section on the system itself, and it's all about establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving the system. Now, again, one of the changes in all of these new standards is not only do you have to continually improve your performance, you have to continually improve the system itself. And also, by doing that, the idea being that you achieve the intended outcomes, one of which was continual improvement of energy performance. So it's about making sure that you've got a system in place to ensure that the processes are controlled, processes are carried out as planned, and ultimately those processes achieve the desired results, whatever they may be. We expect the system to define process interaction. All of these standards now really require a process approach. So not necessarily saying we're going to look at clause 1, clause 3, clause 5, clause 8. That's what we're doing on this presentation. But what we're increasingly seeing now in our management systems as implemented in businesses is there may be a document that controls the process. So let's say we're talking about, I don't know, but let's say powder coating oven, which is something that might use a lot of energy. There may be one procedure that covers how that powder coating process works. It will cover the quality aspect. So it'll talk about how the work is maybe loaded in. It will talk about the settings that you maybe need to get the desired effects. It will talk about the health and safety aspects of that process. It will talk about obviously closing the doors, maybe wearing gloves when you're handling products. It will talk about the energy settings of it, and it will talk about environment. So it's all about defining things as a process, and that's what this standard is no different. It's asking you to look at how processes are managed, not just necessarily how clauses of the standard are managed. The standard requires that it's, as all standards do, that it's integrated into the wider business processes, be they design, development, procurement, HR, sales, marketing, whatever. And then if you were writing this standard from scratch, then obviously the knowledge that you gain in 4.1 and 4.2, which is context and needs of interested parties, that information should then be, you should ensure that the system is there to control those risks and opportunities, to manage the risks and enhance the opportunities. So to consider the knowledge you gain in context and interested parties. Leadership and commitment, nice easy one really. It is all about top management leading the way. It's not about commitment anymore. It's gone on from there. I did once interview somebody, I won't say who, from a fairly large, well-known company, and the managing director, when I started asking him about leadership, his answer was, well, I attend the management review and I've signed the policy. What more do you think I'm going to do? I pay somebody to be my energy manager. And that's not leadership. That's not leadership at all. You can see what's in there. And when we audit leadership. Yes, we'll speak to the leadership team, we'll speak to the managing director, whoever they may be, but we'll also audit leadership by looking at how the business operates. So, for instance, when strategic business decisions are made, is reference given to energy management? I've had a number of occasions when I've spoken to energy managers and I'll say, oh, I see you've put up a new wing on the new office block, or there's a new warehouse gone out the back. I'm a bit disappointed by the lighting that's in there or the heating system that's gone in. And they'll go, oh, yeah, he said, I'm the last to find out. By the time I got involved, it had all been sorted out. The architects and the company decided what they were doing, and therefore I wasn't involved. That's not leadership in terms of ENMS. And we need to ensure that decisions that businesses take are considering the energy performance of either equipment we're buying or processes we're developing. We need to ensure that the business objectives are in line with our energy objectives, or the other way around, maybe the energy objectives are in line with business objectives. Leadership and commitment is about putting in the appropriate level of resources. Now, clause 7.1 is actually on resources. I would have put resources in here rather than in a separate section, but I still think that that's a key part of leadership. Are we resourcing there? It's there to make sure that the management system gets appropriate involvement from across the business. This issue about, well, I employ an energy manager, that's his job. That's not what it's all about. And we'll see why in a minute. It's about leaders promoting continual improvement, both in energy efficiency and in the management system, and ensuring that the performance indicators, that's what EMPI stands for, the energy performance indicators appropriately represent energy performance. I think that's fairly standard. I'm not going to dwell on that. That's no different to the other standards. That's who top management are, person or group of people who direct and control the organisation at the highest level. The only point I would make is that if a business is implementing an ENMS, energy management system, at a site that's maybe just a ring-fence site and isn't part of a, it's part of a wider business, top management rests with the senior management within that business unit, not necessarily the company managing director who may be sat sometimes in a different country. There might be a dotted line to show that that person has some influence and input, but ultimately top management will be the senior management within the scope of the system. And the new standard requires that top management ultimately take accountability for the effectiveness of the system. The buck stops at their desk. There's a requirement for an energy policy. I see an increasing number of 14,001 and 50,001 systems that have a combined policy. That's not an issue, so long as you can tick the boxes that each standard requires, and there are a couple of unique 50,001 clauses within the policy, or should I say commitments. Particularly the committing to ensure the availability of information and necessary resources to achieve the energy objectives and targets. As you can see, it talks about legal requirements there, but if you use the term compliance obligations, that is acceptable. And the other bit really is the third one from the bottom, that the policy has to support the design and procurement for energy efficiency. So to be honest, a 14,001 policy would almost tick all of those boxes so long as you added in the bits about availability of information and also the design and procurement for energy efficiency. Roles, responsibilities and authorities, this is a fairly key one actually, because this changes how things are organised a little bit. As with all the other standards, there is now no requirement, no formal requirement for a manager. So the 9,001 doesn't require a quality manager anymore, 14,001 doesn't require an environmental manager. This standard has a formal requirement, and the requirement is that there has to be an energy management team set up. That's how the standard words it now. That has the responsibilities, as you can see in the slide. Now, I have had the question asked, can we have a team of one? And arguably the standard doesn't say you can't, but the intention of having an energy management team is to reinforce this issue that energy is everybody's responsibility. It doesn't just rest with Fred, third door on the left down the corridor. It is everybody's responsibility. And to have a collective team that covers a number of areas across the business, production, maintenance, maybe design, etc., to have a team of 4 or 5 people managing how energy works is going to reinforce that idea. Right, moving on to the main other clause that's sort of changed and is slightly different to all of the other standards. So the planning clause is all about now addressing the issues that we found in 4.1 and 4.2. So these are the context issues. These are the things that are going to help you or get in the way, the risks and the opportunities. It's about managing those issues. How are we going to grasp those opportunities? How are we going to mitigate those risks to make sure that we achieve those 3 intended outcomes, as you can see in the middle there? But ultimately, what we have to make sure is that we were planning to achieve continual improvement. So it's all about planning to address those risks and opportunities. And it's making sure that we integrate and implement the actions into our management system, making sure that we can, any processes we have that use energy, how are we going to make sure that they are performing properly? How are we going to make sure that we're integrating those opportunities into our processes? How are we going to make sure that we're managing the risks? And ultimately, to then evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. That's the plan, do, check, act bit, of course, coming out again. So the objectives bit is a policy commitment, as you've seen. Now, again, interestingly, this standard, yet again, has gone away from the Annex SL format, has retained the term target. If you think to 14,001 or 9,001, it's objectives and planning to achieve them. You don't see the word target in there. This standard has kept that term target in there. Now, again, I've seen 14,001 systems that still refer to targets, and I'm not bothered. Doesn't really matter. It's what you're achieving that's important. I think they've kept the term target in there because more often than not, in energy terms anyway, the objective is leading to a measurable target. So we're talking about a measurable, numbered, if you like, target. We're going to reduce our energy consumption by 5%. We're going to improve the energy performance of this particular piece of process. We're going to improve that by 3%. We're going to use 5,000 kilowatt hours less on this particular process next year. Those are the sorts of things that we have to think about when we're setting our objectives. Now, another issue I have slightly is if we're working our way through the standard in order, the standard is slightly out of order here because it tells you the objectives must relate to, in part, SEUs. Now, we haven't talked about SEUs yet. SEUs come further on. So SEUs are significant energy uses. It's like the energy version of a significant aspect. So we haven't got to that yet, but you've got to consider them. You don't have to have an objective for each SEU. That's one misconception I wish to clear up now. You have to consider the significant energy uses. But there you can see what needs to be there, just the same as 14,001. You need to set objectives and targets. And ideally, the targets must be measurable. And then we need to plan from each of those objectives. There needs to be a management plan on how we're going to achieve those targets. Who, what, and when, what resources are we going to need, how are we going to evaluate the results, and then the outcome, the way, if we're going to change how we work in order to achieve an objective, that then needs to be integrated into our business processes. So is it about altering, going back to that powder coating oven, is it about altering the process that says, well, in order to reduce the energy usage, we've got to make sure that we shut the doors? For instance, if we're not putting product in, all right, if the line's not running, we're stopping for lunch, we close the doors. That would give you an energy performance improvement, but it's a change to a business process. Now, the energy review has stayed. That's not changed at all. The energy review, the way I best describe this is the 50,001 version of the aspects and impacts evaluation. If you understand what you're doing with that in 14,001, you have a pretty good idea what you're doing on the energy review. It's about analysing energy usage and consumption. It's about identifying the current types of energy in use. So remember, we said it's electricity, gas, oil, diesel, that type of thing. Steam, maybe. You might have some, I don't know what else, might you have some biomass, something like that. So there's various types of energy types that are in use. To identify how we've used energy in the past, how we're using energy currently, and the amount of energy that we're using. And then based on that analysis, to identify what our significant energy uses are. Now, you don't need a complicated set of spreadsheets to work this out, like you would maybe in 14,001 with weighting factors and risk and impact on the environment, etc., etc. This is a pure numbers game. Which bits of kit, which processes that we operate, which buildings use the most energy? And it's as simple as that. Quite often when you're trying to do this, this is an area that we sometimes get identification of requirements for sub-metering, because in order to work out how much something's using, you might need to be able to meter it better. But that might be part of an objective, to be able to better manage our energy usage, to work out where we're using energy, and to implement a sub-metering strategy. Now, once we've identified where we're using energy, we then talk about the relevant variables. And what we mean by variables is, what is it that makes us decide, or what is it that affects how much energy we use? So if it's heating, it's the weather. If it's cold, we're going to use more heating. If it's a manufacturing process, the amount of work coming through is going to affect how much energy we use. So what we need to think about is how much energy we use and what are the things that affect that energy usage. What are the key variables? So it's working out our current performance, identifying those that can influence that. So is it an internal? Is it customer related? Is it down to Fred, who sets the settings in the morning? Is it his job? Is he controlling that? Who has that impact on influencing those? And then coming out of that, to identify and prioritize opportunities for improving energy performance. One bit that's moved, and this is a change, we also have to then estimate future energy usage. So in other words, what are we expecting to do in the next period, whatever that might be? That used to sit within the management review. That's actually been moved and brought into the energy review. So it's past, present, and future as part of the energy review. You have to update the energy review just in the way that you would update your aspects register. At either defined intervals or if things change. And one of the things that we look at changing are what we call the static factors. So any significant energy use has two parts to it. It has a static factor, which are things that generally don't change. So the static factor might be the oven, it might be the machine, it might be the heating system you've got. That doesn't change unless you decide to have a big investment. That's the static factor. The variables are what affects how that static factor operates. Now, that's an important context we need to bear in mind for when we come on to looking at performance indicators. However, you have to retain as documented information how you've carried out the energy review, and that needs to be a documented process. Now, I'll give you prior warning, we're going way over on time. I apologise if that's the case. If you feel you want to stay, stay. If you feel you need to leave, leave, and you can pick this up again on the recording. But I'm going through things in quite a bit of detail, and I'm guessing from the fact that we've not had any questions yet, that I'm actually answering all your questions. So I'm hoping that that's going well. So performance indicators, and performance indicators are really the key to being able to demonstrate continual improvement. So performance indicator is actually measuring energy performance. So absolute energy. So in other words, last year our energy bill says we used 25,000 kilowatt hours. That is not a performance indicator. It's a measure of absolute energy usage. A performance indicator and energy performance are about measuring energy against something else. And usually, with a significant energy usage, you would measure energy performance against a key variable. So for instance, if it's a machine, you might say kilowatt hours per 100 widgets produced. If it's heating, and I'm not going to go massively into this concept, but there's a way of scientifically saying it's been warmer or colder than normal. It's a thing called degree days. We might say that we're going to measure energy performance based on temperature and degree days. You might talk about energy usage per staff member, per square foot of office space or square meter of office space. You might do it on sales, turnover. A performance indicator is an amount of energy measured against a key variable. And that's why understanding this concept of static factors, key variables, and ENPIs is key to being able to demonstrate continual energy improvement. So that's a concept that I want to sort of ram home particularly, that it's something that we need to understand, because the people who are struggling to demonstrate performance improvement, and energy performance improvement doesn't necessarily mean you're using less energy. Energy performance improvement might mean you're using more energy because your production's gone up, but you're using it more effectively. The standard requires that you set a baseline. So we have to demonstrate continual improvement against a set point in time. It doesn't say what that set point in time is, nor does it say how far back the baseline has to be set. All I ask is that a baseline covers all of the variables in an organization's energy usage. Most people pick a year, simply because you've covered all of the variables in here. You've covered winter, so you've covered all 4 seasons. You've covered periods of cold, you've covered periods of warm, you've covered busy times of the year for an organization, you've covered quieter times of the year. The other thing that I ask for, and again, this isn't in the standard, but this is a strong recommendation from me, because otherwise we have problems at the assessment. As a guide, allow 1 full year between the baseline and the current year. So we're sat in 2021 at the moment. I would not particularly want to see 2020 as a baseline, because we need to then have a year to compare that with. So make sure you've got a full year between the baseline and the current year, because then we can see that full cycle compared against the baseline year. Now, the other concept which gets a bit confusing is the baseline can change. And you can reset the baseline on a number of occasions. You can reset it if the performance indicators no longer reflect the organization's performance. You might decide that the business has changed so much since we did the baseline that we're going to reset it. You might reset the baseline if there's been major changes to the static factors. So in other words, let's say that you've put a whole new manufacturing process in, you've ripped out all the old machines and you've put a nice new high-tech system in. That's going to change those static factors. That's going to affect the performance of the ENPIs. You might want to change your baseline again and reset the baseline. Or you might decide we're going to reset the baseline every 3-4 years, something like that. It's up to you, but we need to keep changing, making sure the baseline is current. Finally, coming back to the bit about planning again, we need to make sure that we're planning to collect energy data. So this is a new clause. So the whole standard, as I said, is much more proactive. So we have to now plan on how are we going to collect that energy data. And that's when I talked about things like, have we got the required equipment in place to be able to give us the measurements we need? Do we need to think about a process of sub-metering? Do we need to look at equipment that we can actually, they call them clamp-on meters, where you can put a meter around a cable running into a machine and you can actually collect the data like that. You might want to do, say, a 24-hour or a 48-hour sample of how a machine uses energy using a clamp-on meter. There's all different ways, but you need to plan on how you're going to pull that information together. Now, I'm going to skip through the next slides pretty quickly because you can read them, you can see what's in there, but actually very little has changed. So we've got the bit about competency, very similar to 2011 version of the standard, other than it's more competency related rather than training related. And we need to identify what competencies people need in order to carry out a particular task. And if they haven't got that competency, we can look at ways of upskilling them, which might be training, might be mentoring. It's not necessarily around training. One of our internal exams that I make our assessors set when they're starting to do this, I ask a question: does the standard require all your staff to be trained in energy management? And invariably people put yes. And the standard doesn't say that. The standard says they have to be competent. Training may be a part of that. So you don't have to train everybody. Awareness, people have to be aware of what they're doing. They have to be aware of the energy policy. If you remember, there's a policy commitment that states that we have to make information available on energy performance, and that is part of what this is about. People have to understand how what they're doing can have an impact on energy performance, how they can contribute to the effectiveness of the company, and actually the implications or risks of not conforming. It might be a kick up the backside, it might be disciplinary, but it might also be, well, actually, we're going to, by not doing that or by doing that wrongly, you're going to seriously impact on our ability to improve our energy performance. Communication, there's one little bit in here that's extra to the other standards, and again, it's an area that we look at. Obviously, the top two bullet points are fairly standard across all of the standards. The bullet point I want to concentrate on is the third one. There has to be a formal process by which staff, visitors, contractors, anybody can input and provide feedback on improvements to the ENMS and energy performance, whether it's a suggestion scheme, whether it's questionnaires, whatever. There needs to be a formally documented process. And then finally, within this section, we need to make sure that we are documenting all the information that we need. Now, the sad person that I am, and the next slide, I'm just going to hold off moving on to the next slide for a second. People tell me the next slide is the most useful slide in the entire presentation. I ought to perhaps have a drum roll before we move on to the next slide, but people tell me it's the most useful slide and the one that they print off and use as a checklist. I've been through the standard, and everywhere where the standard says documented information must be held, I've put that onto this slide. Now, the standard itself doesn't use the term documents and records anymore. That's the old standard. However, I believe that that's a concept that we understand, and that there is a slight difference between something that's a document and something that's a record. A record tends to, as the name suggests, might record something. So I've split them out into documents and records, but the standard calls them all documented information. As part of our audits, we will expect to see everything on there evidenced. Obviously, there's a bit of a safety net at the bottom, plus any documented information necessary. But generally, that is the full set of documents that the standard requires that you hold. And if you want to print that off and use it as a checklist, feel free. That's why people like that slide. I'm going to go through the next slides again pretty quickly because operational planning is not too dissimilar. There's a couple of extra clauses compared to, say, 14,001, but we're now moving on to the doing bit, to making sure that we now implement and control those processes that we've decided. So our SEUs, our significant users, how are we going to control them? What sort of process control have we got in place? What sort of documentation do we need? What sort of criteria do we need to set temperature controls for the ovens and things like that? How do we set them? How do we change them? Where does that information come from? All this sort of information is part of operational planning and control. But ultimately, it's about making sure that we have processes in place to control our significant energy uses. And those processes needed to be in accordance with established criteria. So in other words, what is it that decides what we set that oven at? It might be that the powder coating supplier says that in order to get the finish that you want, you need to set that oven at 180 degrees and you need to keep the parts in there for 10 minutes. That is established criteria. We need to make sure that we can control planned changes. So in other words, if we decide to change something, we might decide to change the powder coat supplier. They may say, well, actually, you can run our paint at a slightly lower temperature. So therefore, we need to plan how we're going to change that document. We also might need to review the consequence of unintended changes. So we might find actually that setting things as we thought isn't working. We might need to tweak things. How do we control those changes? And then a little bit about outsourced significant energy uses. I'm not too worried about those. Outsourced processors, there's a whole debate about what outsourced processors are, and outsourced processors are not suppliers. The best example I can quickly give in an outsourced process, and this is a real example, is a particular company I work with in warehousing that have all their forklift trucks provided by a certain manufacturer. And because they've got about 70 forklift trucks on site, the manufacturer has a full-time person working within their company. They've got their own little compound in the corner of the warehouse where they service and update, if you like, the forklift trucks. But the person working in there actually works for the forklift truck manufacturer. That is an outsourced process. So we need to make sure that that person is also working, because they're using our energy ultimately. So it's about making sure that those elements are controlled as well. Design and purchasing are the next two, and they sort of go hand in hand. Anything that we're going to change, whether it's modifying or renovating facilities, equipment, updating our systems, or energy using processes, if they can have a significant impact on energy performance, or if they're going to use any equipment that we're buying that will have a significant energy use, we have to make sure that we design and purchase this equipment with a view to performance improvement. So the poor old energy manager who's the last person to be told when a new building's been designed, that person needs to dig their heels in and go back and waive this clause and say, look, you're outside the clause of the standard here. It's an issue we pick up. I've raised non-conformances on that issue. I've raised non-conformances against the policy. I once raised a non-conformance on 50,001 against the managing director because he'd signed the policy that said we're committing to purchasing and design for energy efficiency, and he hadn't. And he came back and said, well, what are you raising a non-conformance against me for? I didn't buy that equipment. I said, no, but you've signed the policies to say your company will do that. Signing the policy isn't just putting a name at the bottom. You've got to take ownership. And that's what part of this is all about. This last clause, or the last couple of clauses, are really no difference. Performance evaluation, what we're going to monitor, how we're going to monitor it. So this is really now coming back to the planning for energy monitoring, energy measurement that we saw at the end of clause 6, making sure that we're measuring what we need to measure. Do we need any equipment that might be calibrated? Do we have to have meters calibrated, anything like that, or any verified equipment, etc., etc. When we're going to do the monitoring, how we're going to analyze the results, how we're going to communicate the results. That's a fairly standard procedure, same as 14,001, making sure that we've got all the information we need. That hasn't changed from the other standard. Neither has this standard. It always makes me smile that it's called evaluation of compliance, and it's evaluation of compliance with a clause that doesn't exist. But it's evaluating conformity with legal and other requirements that, if you remember, said we tucked away in needs of interested parties. Again, hasn't changed. So it's all about making sure that we are, if the law says we're doing something, if we have a commitment to do something, are we doing it? Can we evidence that it's being done? That's quite nice and straightforward. Internal audit, I don't want to teach you how to audit. You know what you're doing, I hope. The requirements of this clause are absolutely no different, other than part of the internal audits against this standard are making sure that we are auditing against our own energy performance improvement. Are we achieving what we're supposed to be achieving? Don't just wait for the external assessor to come along and ask for that. It needs to be covered in an internal audit. We need to reflect our how we operate if that's not happening. We need to look at policy commitments, objectives, targets, and also consider the results of previous audits. Management review hasn't changed at all, other than the one bit about forward-looking energy performance. In other words, what are we anticipating to use? That's been moved out of here and put into the energy review. But there we go, that's just really what we've to look at, the inputs and the outputs of a management review. And again, it's a process, not necessarily a meeting. Right, a couple of questions coming up. We'll come on to those in a second. I want to just get through this first of all, so that those people who need to disappear can disappear, because we're already 5 minutes over. Right, one of the things that is causing a couple of issues is this term improvement. And the standard requires that there is a continual improvement in the standard of the system, and also improvement of energy performance. Now, let's get the easy bit out of the way. How we deal with non-conformities, that's no different to any other standard. If we raise a finding at an internal audit, or if I raise an audit as an external assessor, you've got to deal with it, and you've got to make sure that you address the issues, and that's no different as it would be under 900114 or the old version of the standard. Making sure that the actions you take are appropriate to the issue. That's fairly straightforward. The bit that's causing a problem has come from a supplementary standard initially, which was ISO 50003, which I'm not going to go into because it applies to us and not to you. It's a requirement for bodies providing audit and certification of management systems, and it sits alongside the standard that guides how we operate, which is ISO 17021. That tells us how we do our audits. However, one of the changes in definitions was the definition of major non-conformity. In that standard, it said that audit evidence that energy performance was not improved becomes a major non-conformity. Now, under the old standard, there was a little bit of discussion, because actually it didn't say in the old 50001 standard that this was a formal requirement. Clause 10.2 of 50001 2018 is a specific requirement for continual energy performance improvement. And obviously, with any clause of the standard, failure to meet a clause of a standard would result in a major non-conformity. Having said that, I've yet to raise a major non-conformity, because in nearly every case we can go back to looking at the performance indicators. If the performance indicator that you have chosen isn't giving you the necessary figures, then we need to go back and have a look at that. However, we can normally come up with something that will give us an element of performance improvement. Now, what's interesting is it's performance improvement based upon the baseline, which does allow for a little bit of backtracking, shall I call it. Be careful to use the word continual and not the word continuous. The standard uses continual, which is performance improvement, but not necessarily in a linear fashion. The analogy I use is a set of stairs compared to a ramp. A set of stairs is continual, so the general movement is upwards. However, there are periods of not moving, if you like, the stairs themselves. Continuous is never ceasing improvement, and that's a ramp. And I've had a couple of people who've used the word continuous and have argued that that's the word they want to use, but then can't evidence that they're better today than they were yesterday. So there's a couple of other definitions in there that we need to think about, but I'll let you read those particularly yourself. So just bear in mind that we do need to make sure that this concept of continual improvement underpins what it is that you're doing. Now, the transition process, as you can see there, the certificates will expire. I'm hoping you can see there. I'm hoping, let me just close something, because as far as I'm aware, on a previous version of the slide, I haven't dated that, but it is right. So the certificates do expire. If you haven't done any transition at all, and you haven't contacted us or anything, any existing certificates to 2011 standard will expire automatically on the 31st of January 2022. You can transition in one of three ways. You can transition at a reassessment, and that's what most people do. I notice there's a few people attending from a company I'm auditing in a few weeks' time, and they are doing their transition as part of their reassessment, and that's the way we would recommend. It may well be that you haven't now got a reassessment due before the 31st of January. You've still got a 2011 certificate in place, but you haven't got a reassessment due. It can be done at a surveillance, or it can be done as a special anytime visit. Obviously, there's an extra cost to that. The transition will automatically add 1 day to your certification time. That's not our choice, that's a UCAS requirement. So no matter what the size of the business is, no matter whether you've got a 1-day assessment or a 10-day assessment, the transition will add 1 day to that. That is a requirement. The process is exactly the same as it was for the other standards that have transitioned, the 914. Not quite the same as 45, because 45 technically wasn't a transition, that was a migration because it was a completely new standard. This is a transition. It's been decided that the changes to the standard are significant. I actually don't think they are, off the record, but it was decided by UCAS that the changes were deemed significant, which means that we've to add this extra day. We will perform what we call value-added assessment. That's a basic principle that we work on, that we add value from our assessments. And as I've said, the standards will, you can carry it out in one of those three ways. So we can, as I've done with a number of organisations, we can do like a mock assessment, we can do a preliminary evaluation, we can do that as a standalone 1 day. That would have no bearing on formal certification and doesn't count towards assessment time. I guess it's a little bit like taking your car for a pre-MOT. Tell us what's wrong, give us a chance to sort it out so that we can then have it assessed and we know we won't fail. If you want to do that, speak to your assessor, speak to me, or speak to NQA Sales. The transition audit, you'll be contacted about a month before the actual audit. There's a gap analysis document that needs to be completed. It's form TR006, that will be supplied to you. You need to have carried out an internal audit against the newly updated processes, procedures, and you must have carried out a management review against the new standard. So we're only 15 minutes over, that's not bad for me. So a summary, obviously the new standards adoption of the Annex SL high-level structure. There's been some clarification in the standard of what we mean by the energy review and a little bit more guidance. There's some additional guidance in the standard on the normalization of performance indicators and the associated baseline. So ENB, that's what it stands for, EN Energy Baseline. There's a little bit more clarification in that new clause at the end of clause 6 about data collection, and there's some clarification on the requirements for a data collection plan. And the definitions of performance indicators and baseline have been clarified. Don't forget, the deadline has been extended to the 31st of January 2022. That's the main point that we wish to make, that you've got an extra 6 months, but before we know where we are, it'll be January next year. So where do we go now? Take a completely fresh look at your energy management system. Take it as an opportunity to reevaluate what you're doing. Look at our website with an awful lot of information that I've written that's on there. Up-to-date support. There's a lot of transition materials in there that'll help you. That doesn't just apply to NQA clients. We'd like you to be an NQA client, but the website's open to anybody. It's not behind a firewall. It's not behind a password protected area. Anybody can and does download that information. Look at these key changes as opportunities for improvement. Make changes to your documentation to reflect the new structures as necessary. Make sure that you implement the requirements on leadership, risk, and context of the organisation. Review the effectiveness of your current controls. Look at what you've currently got in place, but assume that they all may have to be changed. They might not, but start off with that assumption that they do. And make sure you carry out that gap analysis. It will help you. Even if you're not an NQA client, it's an interesting document to use and will help you through the transition process. This was put in by our marketing team, but it's another, just a little sales spiel, if you like. We also have now what we call advanced training courses that don't just look at standards, but look at particular areas. They're very short, very snappy, 2-3 hour training courses that look at in detail particular areas of management system. And anybody that's interested in something that isn't there, you can always come and talk to us and we'll develop something. These are the sorts of things that we've currently got going at the moment. So, thank you. We got to the end finally. So I've got 2 questions at the moment. That's all, which I'm going to try and attack. If anybody else has any questions, now's a chance to ask. There's a couple of people dropped out already. I can see we've lost about 4 or 5 people. If you want to post any questions, now's your chance to be typing, because I'm aiming to finish certainly in another 5 minutes. If you want to contact me directly, richard.walsh@nqa.com. That's WALSH, richard.walsh@nqa.com. I'm always happy to hear from anybody that wants to send me an email. Obviously, if you are an NQA client, we can't offer consultancy, but we can offer advice around particular interpretations, things like that. What will happen if we try to transition after the date mentioned? I'm taking them in reverse order. Right, so if you try to, if you haven't transitioned by the 31st of January 2022, you will be without a certificate. You won't be able to transition. You will have to start again. I don't know if you've ever played Monopoly, Gabrielle, but it's a bit like go back to go, going back to go. Well, do not pass go. You go back to the beginning. You've got to start again. You would have to reapply and go through a stage 1 and a stage 2 process. So I would urge everybody to make sure you get through the transition period, because as I say, on the 1st of February 2022, if you haven't transitioned, you will not have 50,001. And any certification body that you then contact will want you to start again at the beginning. You'll have missed the boat. Part of me says, if you get to that situation, I have very little sympathy, because you've had 3.5 years to do the transition. This has been extended by 6 months because of coronavirus. So if you haven't got there, then I don't like saying you deserve to be where you are, but I would have no sympathy to anybody that comes along and says, well, we haven't got round to transitioning. We forgot all about it, or we missed the boat. So that's what will happen if you don't. Going back, Stuart. So is it continual improvement each year or over the 3-year certificate cycle? Very interesting. At the moment, it's year on year. However, I talked about this other standard, 50,003. There is a new version of that in draft format at the moment, and that version is indicating that once that's published, that they're recommending that it becomes a 3-year certificate cycle. So at the moment, it is year on year. The problem I'm going to have is that the standard still says it's year on year. 50,003 isn't a standard that we're auditing anybody against. So 50,003 guides us on what we do, but the standard still indicates it's continual improvement. So there might be some interesting discussions around 3-year cycle. If I'm honest, at the moment we're looking for year on year. When that new standard is published, we will be looking for a 3-year cycle. So if things have gone astray, maybe on a year, I won't be too worried, so long as by the time we get to the end of the certification cycle, you are demonstrating continual improvement. With an organisation who lease shared premises, so Regis, whereby energy use is included into the rental agreement, is it better to maintain 14 or go for 50? Good question. Honest answer, not the one that NQA would want me to give you. I'd probably go for 14, maintain 14. If you don't have a huge amount of premises, or you haven't got a huge amount of premises at your own, and you're mainly using rented accommodation, I think that 14,001 will give you what you need. I'm not sure that I could actually put up a valid argument for you keeping 50,001. And finally, the $64,000 question that I can't answer, from Karen. Can an organisation reach the stage where they can no longer improve and they've reached peak efficiencies? Do you want my answer or do you want the official answer? The official answer is no, you can't. My answer is yes, you can. I've asked UCAS to clarify to us and the industry in general what happens when an organisation cannot improve anymore. And the answer I've got back is they have to keep on improving. And I've said I'll welcome that when we get to that position and we fail to raise major non-conformances and you pick that up. So the sensible answer is yes, they can. I'm conscious it's 2:20 and I could talk about this about the next half hour. The disappointing thing, and if you're willing to stay with me for 5 minutes, I'd appreciate it. The disappointing thing I have with the new standard is that a lot of my clients were anticipating moving towards renewable energy sources as a way of continually improving their energy performance. In other words, what they were thinking about was what I term energy coming in over the threshold. So in other words, energy that you were buying in from an electricity company. So by investing in putting solar PV on the roof, you are generating your own energy cleanly, and you are not buying energy from outside. So therefore, that must be a performance improvement. The standard in the annex clearly states that the move to the implementation of renewable technologies does not constitute performance improvement. And in my mind, and I'm sort of happy to be quoted on this, and I said this in a discussion I was having this morning with a load of consultants. In my mind, that one phrase has signed the death knell for 50,001 because of the point that you just made, Karen, that you'll get to a point where the only way you can improve is to start looking at renewable technologies. And at the moment, 50,001 treats a kilowatt hour as a kilowatt hour. It doesn't matter whether it's come from a coal-fired power station or whether it's come from a solar array on your roof. A kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour. And that standard is in danger, or this standard is in danger of being left behind. And certainly a lot of my clients, if it wasn't for ESOS and using it for ESOS compliance, then people wouldn't bother with 50,001 anymore. And what we're seeing, and we do other webinars on this, we're seeing a gradual move away from 50,001 into carbon management standards, and looking at in particular, and it's a standard we're getting a lot of interest in at the moment, PAS 2060, which is the standard for the public verification, validation of carbon neutrality. And that's a whole new webinar, and there's a webinar scheduled, I think, coming up. I've already done one, and we're doing other webinars on that. And I think that the people who write 50,001 have totally lost touch with what energy management is all about and look at it purely from an energy perspective, and that is not the direction that we're moving in. So I'm sorry to end on a slightly negative note, but I want to be realistic. And I'm not so sure that in its current format, 50,001 has much life in it, because people will move away, because people are looking at making performance improvements through renewable technologies, and the standard doesn't allow for that, which means in my book the standard is becoming less and less relevant. So there we go. I've said I'll get off my soapbox now. So that's it really. Many apologies that we've gone way over, but sadly when you buy into a webinar run by me, you'll find I go on and on forever and ever because I have a lot to say. So thank you for your time. Thank you for joining in. If you've any questions, thank you again to some of the positive comments that are now coming through. Thank you. If you want to have any discussions further, remember richard.walsh@nqa.com. There you go. I agree with you, Chris, if I'm honest. So thank you for where we are on that, but I want to be realistic. I don't want to try and dress things up that they're not. And I think it's been a missed opportunity to have made a standard that would have been real, that would have genuinely moved people forward in the improvement of how they perform from an energy perspective, but it's missed that opportunity, unfortunately. And I think, sadly, it will become more and more irrelevant. And as far as I'm aware, if certainly with a lot of my clients, if ESOS as a piece of legislation disappears, we will probably lose the majority of our 50,001 clients. Anyway, keep in touch. As I say, remember the email address. If you have any questions, any points you want to make on a one-to-one basis, give us a shout. You can go back and listen. Feel like it's a bit like we're on TV now. Listen again, catch up TV. We are on YouTube. You will get a link to the slides. You will get a link to the presentation. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. And I'll catch you again sometime. But look at any other webinars we're doing. I'm running a few more on lots of other topics as well. Keep in touch, and thanks for your time. Cheers. Bye-bye.